Ever feel like your memory is, I don't know, failing you? Like you're relying on reminders for everything.
You're definitely not alone in feeling that way.
Right. And it's funny, we're diving into this Reddit thread, someone asking about, wanting to improve their memory.
Hmm.
And so many comments are like, I had a great tip, but I totally forgot what it
The
was.
irony of it all, isn't it? It's very relatable, though.
It really is. But we're here to sift through that, right? Find those actual gems of advice.
Exactly. And maybe bust a few myths along the way.
Okay, so this thread had everything from people swearing by specific apps
Yeah.
to, and I'm not kidding, vitamin recommendations.
Yes, the quick fix, always tempting.
Always. But before we get to those, maybe let's step back a bit to the fundamentals.
Back to basics, always a good place to start. We talk about sleep, exercise, diet as, important for our overall health.
Right.
But we often forget just how crucial they are for a healthy, well-functioning brain.
It's easy to let those things slide, though, especially when you're busy, stressed.
It is, but think of it this way. Your brain, it's like a garden, right?
Okay.
You can't expect plants to thrive without sunlight, water, good soil.
Makes sense.
Brain's the same way. It needs the right conditions to function at its best. And one user, they specifically mentioned struggling with their memory after a car accident.
Oh, wow.
Their username was Mediocre Beat, something like that. But it just highlights how important things like good nutrition, sleep are for brain recovery, especially after an injury.
So it's not just about, like, preventing memory decline as we age. It's about giving our brains what they need to just function day to day.
Exactly.
So we've got our brain garden all prepped. We're sleeping, exercising, eating right.
Check, check, check.
But what about the actual learning? Like, I see a lot of just read more. Is that really all it takes?
Well, reading is fantastic, don't get me wrong, but think about it. How often are you really absorbing what you read? Or are you just kind of skimming? Especially like news feeds, things like that.
Yeah, just scrolling and scrolling.
Exactly. Passive learning, even if it's interesting stuff, it doesn't really cut it when it comes to memory.
So it's not just about what we're feeding our brains, it's how we're digesting it.
Exactly. And I love this one user, Phosphoric Vein, they broke it down as the ACRA strategy.
ACRA.
Yeah, stands for Attention, Comprehension, Recall, and Application. Sounds a little jargony at first, but it makes sense.
Okay, break that down for me.
So attention, obviously you got to be paying attention to something to remember it.
Right.
Then comprehension, actually understanding what you're reading or hearing. But it's the recall and application parts where I think it gets really interesting.
Because that's where you're really taking ownership of the information, not just recognizing it, but bringing it back to mind.
Exactly. It's that difference between like recognizing something on a multiple choice test versus actually being able to explain the concept.
It's like I can read a recipe 100 times, but until I actually make the dish.
You won't really know it, right? You won't remember it the same way.
Exactly. The hands-on experience just burns it in there.
And speaking of making things stick, another user mentioned spaced repetition. Basically, you're spacing out your review sessions, so you're revisiting information right before you're about to forget it.
So instead of like that classic cramming the night before a test, it's better to space it out, review over a longer period.
Think of it like exercising a muscle. You wouldn't, try to get in shape by doing one crazy workout right before a big game, right?
Oh,
It's about consistency. And that ties back into that recall part of ACRA, actively bringing the information to mind. And, even with all that, I feel like a lot of us still hit that wall of just information overload. So many comments mention that feeling of their brain just being completely full.
Oh, absolutely. And it's no surprise, right? Our world is so on all the time. And that feeling of overwhelm, that's actually a real thing. It really impacts our cognitive bandwidth, our ability to focus and process information.
It's like our brains only have so much RAM, and if it's constantly being bombarded with notifications, to-dos, random bits of information.
Right. There's no space left for actual thinking or memory formation.
Exactly. And Feeling Cool Blue put it perfectly. They said, sometimes our memory's not bad, it's being taken up by something else. Yes. And that's where I think having a system is so crucial. Not just for our physical spaces, our desks, our homes,
Right.
but for our minds, for managing all that input.
I'm all about a good system.
Me too. User Giant Through Pathy gave a great breakdown of the Getting Things Done, the GTD method.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
It's all about capturing those to-dos, ideas, projects. So they're not just swirling around in your head, taking
Yeah.
up space,
Yeah.
Like, imagine if you never put your keys or wallet in the same spot. You'd waste so much time searching.
Oh, the worst.
Right. It's like that, but for your mental space.
Okay, so we're clearing the clutter, but how do we actually make those memories I don't know, stickier.
Well, we've got to make those memories more vivid, more, well, memorable.
Hmm.
And this is where things get fun. We're talking about the memory palace.
Okay, yes, everyone in the thread was so fascinated by this. I have to admit, I am too. But I need you to break it down for me.
Okay, so picture your childhood home, or maybe your favorite park, any place you know really well.
Got it.
Now imagine you're walking through that space, and at specific locations, say the mailbox by the front door, that weird crack in the sidewalk, you mentally place items you need to remember.
Okay, so if I need to remember to buy milk, eggs, bread, I could imagine like a giant carton of milk spilling out of the mailbox and a flock of chickens by that crack in the sidewalk.
You got it. And the more vivid, the weirder those images, the better. Because you're essentially creating a story, a journey that you can retrace in your mind.
And each location is like a cue to remember a specific thing.
Exactly. And one user, Country Intelligence 64, actually described their whole process. They created a story around their daily commute, associating tasks and information with specific landmarks along the way.
So instead of a to-do list, they have this like mental map.
Precisely. And I love that because it shows that this isn't just some ancient, dusty technique. It's something you can actually adapt to your own life.
I have to admit, it does sound really cool, but also like a lot of work.
It does take effort, for sure. But that's the thing about all this, right? There's no magic bullet, no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to memory.
It's about finding what works for you.
Exactly. And being willing to experiment and maybe even have a little fun along the way.
And it's like anything else, right? If it feels like a chore, you're less likely to stick with it.
Exactly. And, going back to all the different advice in this thread, that's where I think being a discerning consumer of information is so important.
Because there were some interesting suggestions in the mix.
There were. Like we talked about the memory palace, which is a technique with a pretty solid track record.
Yeah, centuries of people using it.
Right. But then you have things like, oh, just take this vitamin and your memory will be perfect.
Yeah, I think I'm good on that one.
Like you said earlier, healthy skepticism is important. There's no magic pill, unfortunately.
Sadly. But that's why it's so crucial to ask those questions, right?
Absolutely. Like, what's the evidence behind this? Does it actually make sense based on what we know about the brain?
And is this something sustainable? Or is it just a quick fix that I'll forget about in a week?
Because at the end of the day, it's about understanding how your brain works best,
And finding what works for you.
finding what sticks, and honestly, having a little fun along the way. Because isn't it more enjoyable to, build a memory palace in your mind?
Way more fun than flashcards, that's for sure.
Right.
Right.
Because when we're engaged, when we're creating those connections, that's when information really sticks.
It's like, are you going to remember a dry textbook or a really captivating story?
Exactly. And that actually brings me to my final thought for today, and it's a question for everyone listening.
Hmm.
If our brains are wired to remember stories, those vivid experiences, the things that really make us feel something.
Those are the things that stick with us.
Right. So what does that tell us about how we should be approaching learning, information, even just our day-to-day lives?
Ooh, that's a good one to sit with.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because even for us, we're always learning, always looking for new connections.
Always building out our memory palaces.
Exactly.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. But keep those memory hacks coming. We might just feature them in a future episode. Until then, happy remembering.